I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but what happened to me a few years ago still haunts me to this day. It's a story I've hesitated to tell, mainly because most people wouldn't believe it. I'm not even sure I fully believe it myself. But I know what I saw. It was a cold winter in the mountains, and my friend Tyler and I had decided to take a weekend trip up to a remote cabin his family owned. It was the dead of winter, and the snow was thick, blanketing everything in a suffocating silence. The cabin sat deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect getaway, or so we thought. The first day went smoothly. We hiked through the snow-covered trails, admiring the untouched beauty of the mountains. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the cabin, the temperature dropping rapidly. That night, we sat by the fire talking and laughing, enjoying the isolation. There was something calming about being so far away from civilization. By the second day, the weather had turned. A snowstorm was moving in, and we decided it was best to stay inside. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the fire kept us warm. By nightfall, the storm was in full force, the wind shrieking through the trees like some wild, unseen creature. We didn't think much of it at first. It was just the kind of weather you'd expect in the mountains. Then, around midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fireplace. We grabbed our flashlights and checked the breaker box, but there was nothing we could do. The storm had likely knocked out the lines, and we were too far from town to call for help. So, we decided to make the best of it, and went back to the fire. That's when we heard a low, guttural sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on us, but then it came again, louder this time. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, almost like a growl, but slower, more deliberate. Tyler and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you think that is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe a bear," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Bears shouldn't be out in the middle of a snowstorm, and certainly not making noises like that. The growl came again, this time closer. My heart started pounding in my chest. We both grabbed our flashlights and cautiously approached the window. The snow was coming down hard, making it difficult to see anything outside, but there was something just beyond the tree line, a dark, hulking shape moving slowly through the snow. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a thick, muscular build. Its fur was dark and matted, blending in with the shadows of the storm. It moved with an unsettling grace for something so large, its long arms swinging slightly as it trudged through the snow. "Do you see that?" Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stopped, its head turning toward the cabin. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at us through the storm. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unnerving, like it was aware of us, watching us. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, some kind of large animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This was something else. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. Then, without warning, the creature let out a loud, echoing roar that reverberated through the cabin. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a mixture of fury and something else, something almost human. Tyler and I stumbled back from the window, our hearts racing. We grabbed a pair of hunting rifles that were mounted on the wall, but deep down, we both knew they wouldn't do much good against whatever was out there. We waited in silence, listening to the storm and the occasional distant growl. Hours passed, and the creature never came closer. Eventually, exhaustion overtook our fear, and we both fell into a fitful sleep by the fire. When we woke up, the storm had passed. The sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the snow-covered landscape. We cautiously stepped outside, rifles in hand, and looked around. The snow was thick, untouched except for a set of massive footprints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. Neither of us said a word as we packed up and left the cabin that morning. We never spoke about what we saw, and to this day, I still haven't told anyone until now. I don't know what it was that we saw that night. Yeti, Sasquatch, something else entirely. All I know is that it was real. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching. In the winter of 2021, I went on a solo trek in the Himalayas, drawn by the allure of the mountains and the promise of solitude. It was an adventure I had been planning for months, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. Little did I know This journey would confront me with something I had only ever heard of in folklore. I set out from base camp early one morning, eager to explore the trails less traveled. The air was crisp, and the snow-covered peaks looked like they had been painted by a master artist. My guide had warned me about the unpredictable weather and the treacherous paths, but I was determined to press on. The first few days were serene. I followed established trails, enjoying the peaceful silence and the stunning views. I was well prepared and had all the necessary gear: a GPS, extra supplies, and a satellite phone for emergencies. But as I ventured further into the less frequented parts of the mountain range, I began to feel an unsettling presence, as if I was being watched. On the fourth day, the weather took a turn for the worse. Snow began to fall heavily, obscuring the trail and making navigation difficult. I decided to set up camp early to wait out the storm. As evening fell, the wind howled outside my tent, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The isolation was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise, a series of deep, guttural growls that seemed to come from outside the tent. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window flap. The storm had intensified, but I could make out dark shapes moving through the snow. The sounds were unlike anything I had heard before, a haunting mix of growls and heavy footsteps. I mustered the courage to step outside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The snowstorm made visibility nearly impossible, but I followed the sounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I pushed through the snow, I saw a massive figure moving with surprising agility despite the storm. It was covered in thick, matted fur, and its size was immense, far larger than any animal I had ever seen. I froze in place, my flashlight illuminating the creature's form. It was standing on two legs, towering over me. Its face was partially obscured by the storm, but I could make out a broad, powerful build and a pair of glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The Yeti, or whatever it was, let out another guttural growl, shaking the snow from its fur. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. I was paralyzed with fear but knew I had to get back to my tent. I slowly retreated, my movements deliberate to avoid drawing attention. The Yeti seemed to follow me for a short distance, but eventually, it disappeared into the storm. I hurried back to my tent, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just witnessed. The following morning, the storm had passed, and the landscape was transformed into a pristine, snow-covered expanse. I packed up my gear quickly and made my way back to base camp, my encounter with the Yeti weighing heavily on my mind. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, fearing they would dismiss it as a product of exhaustion or hallucination. Once safely back at base camp, I was relieved to be in the company of other trekkers and guides. I kept my experience to myself, not wanting to be ridiculed or doubted. The trek was a success, but the sight of that massive, elusive creature remained etched in my memory. Since then, I've often wondered if I was the only one to witness such a sight. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of the mysteries that the wild can hold. Though I survived the encounter and returned home safely, the memory of that night in the Himalayas, with its haunting growls and shadowy figure, is a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking in the depths of the wilderness. Last winter, I went on a trekking expedition in the Himalayas with a group of friends. The trip was meant to be an adventurous escape, but it quickly turned into a terrifying ordeal I'll never forget. We had been hiking for days, gradually acclimating to the high altitudes and cold temperatures. The scenery was breathtaking: snow-capped peaks, vast white expanses, and the crisp mountain air. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, or so I thought. On the fourth day, our guide, Tenzin, suggested we take a detour to a less traveled path for a better view of the surrounding mountains. We were all eager for a change of scenery, so we agreed. The path was narrow and winding, with snowdrifts piling up along the edges. As the day wore on, the weather worsened. A blizzard rolled in, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. By late afternoon, the snowstorm was in full force. We decided to set up camp earlier than planned, hoping the storm would pass by morning. We pitched our tents quickly and huddled inside, listening to the howling wind and the relentless snowfall. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by an unsettling noise. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just outside the tent. I sat up, straining to hear over the howling wind. The noise was unlike anything I had heard before, a deep, resonant sound that sent chills down my spine. I whispered to my friends, but they were all still asleep, exhausted from the day's trek. I waited for a few moments, and then the sound came again, closer this time. It was accompanied by heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow. My breath caught in my throat, and I grabbed my flashlight, trying to calm my racing heart. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking outside. The storm was still raging, but the snow had momentarily lightened. That's when I saw a massive, shadowy figure standing just a few yards from our campsite. The figure was covered in a thick layer of snow and fur, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light of the storm. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature was enormous, with broad shoulders and long limbs. It had the unmistakable appearance of what people described as the Yeti. I'd heard the legends and stories, but I had never imagined I'd see one for myself. My first instinct was to run, but fear rooted me to the spot. The Yeti stood still for a moment, its gaze fixed on me. I felt a strange mix of terror and awe as I stared back. The creature emitted another low growl, and then it turned and disappeared into the storm. The snow quickly covered its tracks, leaving no trace of its presence. I was shaking as I zipped the tent back up and tried to wake my friends. They were groggy and skeptical when I told them what I had seen, dismissing it as a product of my imagination or stress from the storm. They were right in their own way. We had been enduring harsh conditions, and exhaustion could have affected my perception. Despite their doubts, I couldn't shake the memory of what I had seen. The fear and awe of the moment lingered with me throughout the rest of the trip. We finished our trek safely, and the storm eventually cleared, but the encounter remained vivid in my mind. Back home, I did some research on Yeti sightings and found that many people had reported similar experiences: strange sounds, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, and unexplained disturbances. While there's no concrete evidence to prove the Yeti's existence, the encounter left me with a deep sense of respect for the mysteries that lie hidden in the world. To this day, I don't know exactly what I saw that night in the Himalayas, but I do know it was one of the scariest and most awe-inspiring experiences of my life. Despite the fear, I'm grateful for the encounter. It reminded me of how much we have yet to understand about the world and its secrets. Sometimes, the unknown is far scarier than we could ever imagine, but it also holds the potential for wonder. Last winter, I embarked on a trek through the Himalayas with a small group of friends. It was meant to be a thrilling adventure, exploring remote trails and soaking in breathtaking views. We were well prepared and experienced, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered. We set out in early January, the air crisp and the sky a clear blue. Our base camp was at a high altitude, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and vast expanses of white. The nights were frigid, but our gear kept us warm as we huddled around the campfire, sharing stories and jokes. One evening, while we were settling into our tents, we noticed an unusual noise coming from the distance, a low, rumbling sound, almost like a distant growl. It was faint, but it carried an unsettling quality. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind or perhaps a large animal, and went to sleep. The following day, we embarked on a challenging climb. The snow was deep, and the path was steep, but we were determined. As we ascended, the sky grew overcast, and the temperature dropped. The landscape became increasingly eerie, with twisted, ice-covered trees and shadowy crevices. Around midday, we stopped for a rest and began to discuss the strange noise from the previous night. Our guide, a seasoned local, mentioned that the region was rumored to be inhabited by a mysterious creature, often called the Yeti or abominable snowman. We laughed it off, thinking it was just a local legend, but as the day wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The clouds thickened, and visibility decreased. We decided to make our way back to camp before the weather worsened. As we turned around, I noticed something odd: a large, dark shape moving among the trees far below us. It was too far to make out clearly, but it seemed enormous and oddly humanoid. "Look at that," I said to my friend Mark, pointing toward the shape. Mark squinted but couldn't see anything. Probably just a trick of the light. Despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As we made our way back, the dark shape seemed to follow us, always just out of clear view. I mentioned it to our guide, who grew visibly tense but didn't say much. That night, we huddled together in our tents, the wind howling outside. The noise from the previous night returned, louder and more persistent. It wasn't quite like anything I had heard before: deep, resonant, and oddly rhythmic. Around midnight, I decided to step outside to investigate. The snow crunched underfoot as I made my way a short distance from the camp, my breath visible in the frigid air. I peered into the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. That's when I saw it: a large, pale figure moving slowly among the trees. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen: tall and covered in thick, white fur, with long arms and a broad, heavy frame. It stood on two legs, but its movements were fluid and graceful despite its size. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I was witnessing something extraordinary, but I couldn't fully comprehend it. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I was too mesmerized and terrified to make a sound. The creature seemed to notice me and paused, its glowing eyes reflecting the light from my flashlight. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing into the trees. I hurried back to the camp, my mind racing. When I recounted what I had seen, everyone was skeptical. They didn't doubt my sincerity but thought it might have been a trick of the light or a large animal mistaken in the dark. The next day, we discussed our experiences with the guide. He was quiet for a moment before finally admitting that many locals believed the Yeti was real. Those sightings were extremely rare and often dismissed as myths. He didn't press the matter further but urged us to be cautious and respectful of the wilderness. We finished our trek without further incident, and the sighting remained just that, a sighting, with no concrete evidence beyond my own word. The experience left me with a sense of wonder and a healthy dose of respect for the mysteries of the natural world. Despite the fear and uncertainty, nothing dangerous came of it, and we all returned home safely. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw that night, but the memory remains vivid. Whether it was a real Yeti or something else entirely, it was an encounter that deepened my appreciation for the unexplained and the power of legends. It was early February, and the high-altitude trek through the Himalayas was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. My friends and I had planned this expedition for months, and the thrill of exploring such a remote and breathtaking region was exhilarating. What we didn't anticipate was encountering something that would challenge our understanding of reality. We had set up camp at around 14,000 feet, just below the tree line. The air was thin, the temperature biting, and the snow-covered landscape was eerily silent. That evening, we huddled around a fire, sharing stories and warming up after a long day of hiking. The wind howled outside, and the chill was almost palpable, but the fire provided a comforting warmth. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. We finished our meal and retired to our tents, each of us trying to get some rest for the grueling climb that awaited us the next day. I was the last to crawl into my sleeping bag, my mind racing with excitement and anticipation. Around midnight, I was abruptly awoken by a strange noise. It was a deep, guttural growl, unlike anything I had heard before. The growl was followed by a series of thuds, like something large was moving around outside our camp. My heart raced, and I held my breath, listening intently. I unzipped the tent carefully, peeking outside. The snow was falling lightly, muffling most sounds, but the growl had ceased. I strained my eyes in the darkness, trying to see what was out there. The only illumination came from the dim light of the moon reflecting off the snow. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a massive, shadowy figure standing at the edge of our camp. It was tall, towering over the trees, and covered in dark, matted fur. The figure moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if it was assessing us. I could barely make out its shape, but the sheer size and presence of the creature were terrifying. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, and it was moving closer. I quickly zipped my tent shut and tried to wake my friends, but the cold and fear had numbed me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. I knew we had to be careful. If it was indeed the legendary Yeti, or even something else equally unknown, any sudden movements or noise might provoke it. I lay still, trying to control my breathing and gather my thoughts. The growling returned intermittently, each time closer and more intense. The night seemed to stretch on forever. My friends eventually stirred and whispered questions through the thin fabric of the tent. I told them as calmly as I could about the creature I had seen, though I'm sure my fear was evident in my voice. As dawn approached, the growling and movement ceased. The sky lightened, and the first rays of sunlight began to break through the darkness. We cautiously emerged from our tents, the cold morning air biting at our faces. The camp was untouched, and there was no sign of the creature, only fresh snow covering the ground. We searched the area for any signs of disturbance but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, just pristine snow. It was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. We debated what to do, with some of us wanting to leave immediately and others suggesting we continue with our planned trek. Despite our fear, we decided to proceed with caution. We were careful to avoid the area where I had seen the creature and maintained a heightened awareness of our surroundings. The rest of the trek was uneventful, though the memory of that night stayed with us. The creature I saw remained a mystery. Was it a Yeti, a bear, or something else entirely? When we returned home, we shared our story with others, but skepticism was common. The encounter was dismissed by some as a trick of the mind, a product of the cold and isolation. But for us, it was a chilling reminder of the unknown that still lurks in the unexplored corners of our world. Despite the fear, we were fortunate that the encounter did not escalate, and we returned safely, forever haunted by the shadowy figure in the snowy wilderness. A few years ago, I embarked on what I thought would be a thrilling yet straightforward mountaineering trip in the Himalayas. A group of friends and I had planned a week-long trek through the lower ranges, hoping to experience the beauty and isolation of the high-altitude landscape. Little did I know, our adventure would turn into an encounter with something that still sends chills down my spine. Our trek started on a crisp morning, with clear skies and a sense of excitement in the air. The days passed pleasantly, filled with stunning views and challenging climbs. By the third day, we had reached a remote base camp at around 14,000 feet. The air was thin and cold, and the camp was situated near a small glacier. We were all in good spirits, excited to explore the surrounding area. On the fourth morning, we decided to take a day hike further up the mountain to explore an area known for its striking ice formations. The weather was perfect, clear skies with a gentle breeze. We set off early, taking our time to enjoy the panoramic views and snap photos of the ice formations. Around mid-afternoon, as we were nearing a particularly large ice cave, I decided to break off from the group for a bit of solitude. I found a quiet spot on a nearby ridge where I could take in the scenery and have a moment of peace. I settled down with my camera, scanning the landscape through the lens, trying to capture the essence of the majestic surroundings. It was then that I saw a dark shape moving against the stark white of the ice. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the towering ice formations. But as I focused my camera, the figure became clearer. It was large, covered in dark fur, and moving deliberately across the glacier. My heart raced. I knew the legends of the Yeti, the mythical creature said to roam these remote mountains, but I had always considered them folklore stories to entertain tourists. Yet, here was something that defied logical explanation. The creature was massive, easily towering over the surrounding ice formations. It moved with a surprising grace, its fur rippling in the wind. From my vantage point, it appeared to be moving in a zigzag pattern, as if deliberately avoiding detection. I tried to steady my camera and take photos, but the creature seemed to sense my presence, halting abruptly and looking directly in my direction. I could see its eyes, dark, intelligent, and unnervingly aware. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I remained still, hoping that my presence had gone unnoticed. After a few minutes, the Yeti turned and disappeared into a crevasse, leaving only a faint trail of disturbed snow in its wake. I sat there, breathless and stunned, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The experience was surreal, and I felt a mix of awe and terror. After a few minutes, I decided it was time to rejoin my friends. I hurried back down the trail, my mind racing with what I had seen. When I met up with the group, I was met with curious glances and questions about my abrupt departure. I told them I had just been taking some time alone to enjoy the view, not mentioning the encounter. The rest of the hike back to camp was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I reviewed the photos I had taken. Most of them were blurred or obscured by the distance and the conditions. However, one shot, though not entirely clear, seemed to capture the dark figure against the ice. The image was indistinct, but it showed a large, shadowy shape that matched what I had seen. The following days passed without incident, and we completed our trek without any further unusual encounters. When we returned home, I shared my experience and photos with a few close friends and family. Reactions ranged from disbelief to fascination, but no one could definitively explain what I had seen. To this day, I can't be sure what I truly encountered on that icy ridge. Whether it was a Yeti or some other unexplained phenomenon, the experience remains a haunting memory. I know that despite my fear and uncertainty, we all returned safely, and that knowledge offers some comfort. Sometimes, the mysteries of the world are better left as such, allowing us to wonder and speculate rather than confront.